Behind the glittering streets of Montreal lay a silent empire, an underground world shaped by one man whose influence stretched across borders. This is the story of Vito Rizzuto, not as a legend to admire, but as a cautionary tale of how power built in the shadows ultimately consumes everything around it. Vito Rizzuto's early life cannot be understood without looking at the world he was born into, a world shaped by decades of migration, cultural tradition, and the inheritance of both opportunity and danger. Born in 1946 in Cattolica Eraclea, a small Sicilian town known for its history of poverty, emigration, and local clan influence, Vito's childhood was marked not by luxury but by the tight-knit patterns of Sicilian family life. In the late 1950s, when Rizzuto was still a young boy, his family joined thousands of other Sicilians seeking stability and economic promise in North America, eventually settling in Montreal, Quebec. This move would place him at the crossroads of two worlds, Sicilian heritage and Canadian urban life, each shaping the path he would eventually follow. Montreal at the time was a rapidly changing city. Its Italian immigrant communities formed dense networks of friendship, labor, and cultural continuity. Yet these networks also provided fertile ground for Sicilian-style criminal organizations to transplant themselves from Europe into Canada. Vito's father, Niccolo Rizzuto, became a key figure in this environment, forming connections with other established families and expanding influence in local illicit markets. Growing up in this household meant that Vito was exposed early to conversations, visitors, and dynamics that hinted at a life organized by strict codes, secrecy, and a sense of inherited responsibility. As a teenager and young adult, Vito was described as charismatic, multilingual, and intelligent, traits that made him useful in social negotiations and in bridging generational divides within the Italian-Canadian community. He also witnessed firsthand how Montreal's underworld operated. The city at the time was not simply a patchwork of independent criminal groups. It was a complex ecosystem where Sicilian, Calabrian, Irish, and French-Canadian factions interacted, competed, and cooperated. This environment became Vito's real education, offering lessons on power structures, trust, loyalty, and the management of alliances. By the early 1970s, Vito began moving into his own role within the networks his father had helped establish. What separated him from many others around him was not just inherited connections but a strategic approach to conflict, partnership, and influence. He preferred negotiation over open confrontation, often positioning himself as a mediator who could smooth tensions between rival groups. This ability to avoid unnecessary violence while still maintaining authority allowed him to rise without drawing immediate attention from law enforcement. It also helped him earn a reputation among associates as someone who understood the broader picture rather than acting impulsively. The Montreal underworld at that time was linked deeply to international routes, especially those involving narcotics trafficking and financial networks that extended into the United States and Europe. Rizzuto learned quickly that influence in one city could expand dramatically if one understood how to operate across borders. Trips to Venezuela, Italy, and the United States introduced him to larger players in global organized crime networks. These travels were not simply ceremonial. They exposed him to the scale, revenue, and risk of international operations and gave him access to people who later became strategic partners. Another defining aspect of Vito's rise was his ability to maintain a balance between tradition and modernization. While he respected the old Sicilian customs, such as discretion, hierarchy, and loyalty, he also understood that operating in Canada required adapting to a new environment. He recognized that unlike in Sicily, where power often stemmed from historical lineage, in Montreal success depended heavily on the ability to navigate legal systems, financial markets, and multicultural communities. As a result, he formed connections not only within the Italian community but among other ethnic groups and business circles. These broader relationships expanded the Rizzuto network's influence beyond the narrow confines of a single neighborhood. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Rizzuto's presence became more influential, though still rarely public. His rise was marked by calculated decision-making that prioritized longevity over spectacle. Many people outside criminal circles had little idea of who he was, even as his name quietly became known in law enforcement files. His low-profile approach helped him remain distanced from the day-to-day operations that typically expose high-ranking figures to legal risk. Instead of direct involvement, he often let trusted associates manage various operations while he acted more like a coordinator and strategist. Those who studied his rise often pointed out that Vito operated with a unique blend of caution and assertiveness. He avoided unnecessary exposure but stepped in decisively when alliances fractured or when someone threatened the stability of the organization. His leadership during Montreal's turbulent underworld conflicts demonstrated an ability to maintain control without resorting to constant displays of force. This approach helped establish the Rizzuto network as one of the most dominant and structured groups in Canada during that period. By the time he reached full leadership, Vito Rizzuto was no longer just the son of a Sicilian immigrant but a central figure in a complex criminal landscape. His early life, formed by migration, cultural expectations, urban opportunity, and exposure to the underworld, had set the stage for a rise shaped by strategy, adaptability, and an understanding of both Old World codes and New World systems. Once Vito Rizzuto began asserting his influence in Montreal, his focus shifted to the careful construction and expansion of the criminal network that would eventually become synonymous with his name. Unlike some figures in organized crime who relied solely on intimidation or brute force, Rizzuto emphasized structure, loyalty, and diversification. The Rizzuto crime family was not simply a collection of individuals seeking quick gains. It was designed as a long-term enterprise with clearly defined hierarchies and responsibilities. Understanding how this network was built provides insight into why it became so resilient and powerful. At the core of the Rizzuto organization was the principle of loyalty. Family ties were essential, but Rizzuto also sought to cultivate loyalty among non-family members, creating an inner circle of trusted associates. These individuals were carefully selected for their reliability, discretion, and ability to execute complex operations. Rizzuto recognized that for an organization to endure, it needed a combination of inherited trust and merit-based responsibility. By structuring the network in this way, he could maintain control while delegating operational tasks, minimizing exposure to law enforcement and internal conflicts. The family's activities spanned a wide range of criminal enterprises. From gambling and loan sharking to drug trafficking and money laundering, the Rizzuto network maintained multiple revenue streams that complemented and reinforced each other. Vito understood the importance of diversification. Relying on a single activity made the organization vulnerable, whereas multiple interconnected operations allowed the network to absorb shocks and continue functioning even if one sector faced disruption. This strategic diversification also gave the family greater leverage over other criminal organizations, as it could negotiate partnerships or alliances based on shared interests in multiple markets. A crucial aspect of Rizzuto's network was its international dimension. He did not view Montreal in isolation. Instead, he recognized the opportunities presented by global connections. Over the years, the Rizzuto family established ties with criminal organizations in the United States, particularly in New York and New Jersey, as well as in Europe and South America. These alliances facilitated large-scale drug trafficking, money laundering, and arms smuggling, and also helped the family gain protection and intelligence from partners abroad. International connections gave Rizzuto leverage that most Canadian-based criminal figures lacked, positioning his organization as a significant player on the global stage. The network was also built on a sophisticated system of operations and communication. While the outer layers of the organization handled day-to-day tasks, higher-level planning and sensitive decisions were restricted to a trusted inner circle. Rizzuto carefully controlled the flow of information, ensuring that members only had access to what they needed to perform their roles. This compartmentalization not only reduced the risk of leaks but also maintained discipline and authority within the group. In practice, this meant that associates at different levels were largely unaware of the full scope of operations, making law enforcement investigations far more difficult. Rizzuto's strategic approach also extended to alliances and rivalries. He understood that survival in Montreal's underworld required more than internal strength. It required careful negotiation with other criminal factions. By forming alliances with select groups and neutralizing potential threats through diplomacy or calculated action, Rizzuto expanded his influence while avoiding open conflicts that could attract public or legal scrutiny. This combination of strategic negotiation, selective enforcement, and calculated intimidation became a hallmark of his leadership style. Another factor in the network's success was the emphasis on discretion. Unlike some organized crime figures who sought notoriety, Rizzuto deliberately avoided public attention. He rarely appeared in public, and even within criminal circles, he maintained a low profile. This allowed the organization to operate under the radar of both media and law enforcement, giving it the time and space to grow. It also reinforced a culture of secrecy within the family, ensuring that members understood the risks of exposure and the importance of protecting the organization's inner workings. By the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, the Rizzuto family had evolved into a highly organized, multi-tiered network with influence that extended far beyond Montreal. The organization's operations were systematic, with clearly defined roles, strategic international alliances, diversified revenue streams, and a culture of discipline and discretion. Vito Rizzuto's ability to build and maintain this network was not merely a matter of ambition. It was a calculated exercise in organization, planning, and long-term vision. The network he created became one of the most formidable criminal enterprises in Canadian history, a testament to his strategic mindset and understanding of power dynamics in both local and international contexts. By the time Vito Rizzuto had consolidated power within his family, his influence in Montreal's criminal underworld was both extensive and subtle, operating in ways that were often invisible to the public but unmistakable to those within the city's illicit networks. Unlike leaders who relied solely on fear or violent displays to maintain authority, Rizzuto combined strategic planning, diplomacy, and selective enforcement of force to assert his dominance. His influence was felt not just through direct actions but also through the perception that opposing him carried significant risks, a perception that often deterred challenges before they could even materialize. Montreal's underworld was not a single unified entity. It was a complex ecosystem of rival groups, ethnic networks, and criminal enterprises, including Sicilian, Calabrian, Irish, and French-Canadian factions. Each group had its own interests, territories, and operational methods, yet all were interconnected through alliances, partnerships, and shared markets. Vito Rizzuto's ability to navigate this environment was a key factor in his rise. He understood the delicate balance between collaboration and competition, recognizing that influence was not only about controlling territory but also about shaping relationships, mediating disputes, and determining who had access to resources. One of the defining aspects of Rizzuto's influence was his role as an intermediary and negotiator. He was often called upon to settle conflicts that might otherwise escalate into violent confrontations. Whether it was disputes over territory, trafficking routes, or business deals, Rizzuto's reputation for fairness, albeit within the strict codes of the underworld, allowed him to position himself as the arbiter whose decisions were respected, or at least feared, by rival factions. This capacity for mediation was instrumental in maintaining the Rizzuto family's dominance while avoiding continuous, publicized violence that could draw law enforcement attention. Control over illicit markets was another way Rizzuto exerted his influence. Gambling, drug trafficking, and loan sharking operations were central to Montreal's criminal economy, and through a combination of alliances, intimidation, and strategic partnerships, the Rizzuto family was able to dominate significant portions of these markets. Rizzuto's leadership was characterized by careful observation of the shifting landscape, ensuring that the family remained one step ahead of competitors and law enforcement alike. This required not just internal management skills but also a sophisticated understanding of risk and reward, often making decisions based on long-term consequences rather than immediate gains. Rizzuto also cultivated a level of indirect influence that extended beyond the traditional bounds of organized crime. He understood the power of perception and reputation. His name carried weight even among those who never met him personally. This influence was reinforced by the family's internal discipline, the loyalty of associates, and the calculated visibility of selective actions, acts that demonstrated capability without overexposure. By controlling how and when power was displayed, Rizzuto created an aura of authority that magnified his influence while minimizing vulnerabilities. Importantly, Rizzuto's dominance was not absolute, nor was it maintained purely through coercion. He leveraged a combination of trust, loyalty, and personal connections, particularly among members of the Sicilian Canadian community, to ensure compliance and allegiance. Many associates were drawn to him not merely out of fear, but because he offered stability and predictability in an otherwise volatile criminal landscape. The Rizzuto family became a central hub through which power, resources, and information flowed, reinforcing Vito's status as a key decision-maker whose approval or disapproval could determine the success or failure of operations. Montreal's underworld also reflected international connections, which further extended Rizzuto's influence. Through ties with organized crime groups in the United States, Europe, and South America, he was able to access resources, intelligence, and opportunities that few Canadian crime figures could match. These connections not only strengthened the family's operational capacity but also enhanced Rizzuto's reputation as a figure of global significance in the criminal world. The combination of local control and international reach allowed the Rizzuto family to operate with a degree of autonomy and power unmatched in Canada at the time. Perhaps most striking about Rizzuto's influence was its endurance. Even during periods of law enforcement scrutiny or the imprisonment of key associates, the family retained a cohesive structure and a clear chain of authority. The systems and relationships that Vito had built ensured that his influence was not solely dependent on physical presence but was embedded within the organization itself. Montreal's underworld, as a result, was shaped not just by Rizzuto's actions, but by the enduring frameworks he established, which continued to guide operations long after critical disruptions. In summary, Vito Rizzuto's influence in Montreal's criminal underworld was multifaceted, combining strategic alliances, control over markets, reputation management, and international connections. His power was exercised through a mix of negotiation, discipline, and selective enforcement of force, creating a network that was resilient, expansive, and respected, often feared by rivals. The underworld did not merely react to Rizzuto's presence. It was organized around his decisions and mediated by his authority, reflecting a rare blend of strategic insight and practical leadership within an inherently dangerous environment. One of the most significant events in Vito Rizzuto's life, and a pivotal moment for the Rizzuto crime family, was his alleged involvement in what is commonly referred to as the 1981 triple murders, a case that not only drew international law enforcement attention but also altered the trajectory of organized crime in Montreal and beyond. This episode is critical for understanding both the reach of Rizzuto's operations and the risks inherent in leadership within a criminal empire. The case highlights how personal and organizational ambitions can intersect with international criminal networks, often with deadly consequences. The triple murders took place in New York, targeting 3 prominent members of the Bonanno crime family, one of the 5 families of New York. These killings were part of a violent internal conflict within the Bonanno organization, which had connections to Canadian crime networks. Vito Rizzuto, at the time, was still in the process of consolidating his authority within Montreal, but his Sicilian heritage and family alliances linked him directly to the Bonanno faction involved in the dispute. According to law enforcement investigations, Rizzuto orchestrated or was complicit in these murders as part of a broader strategy to strengthen ties with influential figures in the U.S. Mafia while eliminating rivals who threatened his family's long-term stability and expansion plans. The murders were executed with extreme precision and brutality, reflecting the operational sophistication that Rizzuto and his associates had cultivated over the years. While specific operational details remain sealed in legal documents and law enforcement records, the aftermath made it clear that these were not impulsive acts of revenge. They were carefully planned actions with strategic objectives. The killings sent a clear message to both Canadian and American criminal networks. Challenges to Rizzuto's authority, or his allies' interests, would carry severe consequences. This created an aura of fear and respect that extended far beyond Montreal, solidifying the Rizzuto family's reputation as a force capable of influencing events across national borders. Rizzuto's connection to these murders eventually led to his arrest and extradition to the United States. In 2004, decades after the events, he was charged with conspiracy in connection to the killings, a case that drew international media attention. The legal proceedings highlighted both the reach of U.S. law enforcement into Canadian organized crime and the long memory of transnational criminal investigations. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence linking Rizzuto to the planning and orchestration of the murders, emphasizing his role as a key figure in a broader, ongoing criminal network. Defense teams, however, argued that the case relied heavily on testimony from cooperating witnesses and circumstantial evidence, reflecting the complexities of prosecuting high-level organized crime figures decades after the fact. The triple murders case had immediate and long-term impacts on the Montreal underworld. In the short term, it created uncertainty within the Rizzuto network. With Rizzuto's arrest, a leadership vacuum emerged, emboldening rivals and triggering internal struggles for power. This period saw increased violence, as competing factions sought to assert control over territories, revenue streams, and alliances previously managed under Rizzuto's disciplined guidance. It also demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated criminal networks when key leaders are removed, illustrating a recurring theme in organized crime: the reliance on both structure and the personal authority of its head. Beyond Montreal, the case reinforced the transnational dimensions of organized crime. Canadian authorities and U.S. law enforcement collaborated extensively, sharing intelligence and coordinating investigations across borders. This marked a turning point in the international handling of organized crime, emphasizing the need for cross-border cooperation in tracking figures whose influence spanned multiple jurisdictions. Rizzuto's eventual imprisonment in the U.S. also highlighted the personal risks inherent in a life of criminal leadership. Decades of strategic planning and operational management could be undone by legal action and international prosecution. The triple murders case also had a psychological and symbolic impact on the criminal community. It served as a stark reminder that even high-ranking leaders were not untouchable, and that past actions, no matter how carefully concealed, could resurface with significant consequences. For younger associates, it reinforced the lessons of loyalty, discretion, and the long-term costs of involvement in violent criminal operations. For rivals, it confirmed the dangers of underestimating Rizzuto and the resources he could mobilize, even from prison or across national borders. In retrospect, the triple murders case encapsulates the complexity of Vito Rizzuto's career. It intertwines themes of power, strategy, loyalty, and risk, demonstrating how criminal leadership extends beyond local influence to international operations. While Rizzuto's eventual imprisonment disrupted his immediate plans, it did not entirely dismantle his influence, reflecting the resilience and depth of the organizational structures he had established. The case remains one of the most infamous examples of cross-border organized crime activity involving Canadian figures and serves as a critical chapter in the story of the Rizzuto family, the Montreal Underworld, and the broader North American mafia network. The arrest and imprisonment of Vito Rizzuto marked the beginning of one of the most turbulent periods in the history of the Montreal Underworld. For decades, the Rizzuto family had maintained a carefully structured network, blending strategic alliances, diversified operations, and strict internal discipline. Rizzuto himself had served as the central figure whose authority ensured that conflicts were managed, loyalty was maintained, and the organization operated with minimal disruption. However, once he was removed from active leadership, the fragility inherent in even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises became apparent. Rizzuto's absence created an immediate power vacuum. While the family structure was designed to operate efficiently under the guidance of a strong leader, it was never intended to function without one of Rizzuto's level of authority. Associates who had previously deferred to him now found themselves in positions of decision-making that carried immense risk, and rival factions within Montreal and across Canada saw an opportunity to expand their influence. The vacuum ignited a wave of internal conflict, as former allies and subordinate lieutenants vied for control over territories, operations, and international partnerships that had been tightly managed under Rizzuto's oversight. The period following Rizzuto's imprisonment saw a dramatic increase in violent incidents, including shootings, kidnappings, and assassinations, many of which targeted members of the Rizzuto organization. These attacks were often linked to both internal betrayals and retaliatory actions from rival groups seeking to capitalize on the perceived weakness of the family. The loss of centralized leadership exposed vulnerabilities that had previously been hidden by careful planning and disciplined enforcement of organizational rules. Montreal's underworld descended into instability, and neighborhoods once quietly controlled by the Rizzuto network became flashpoints for criminal conflict. The collapse also had a profound impact on alliances and partnerships, both domestic and international. Connections that Rizzuto had maintained with American and European criminal networks began to fray, as rivals questioned the family's ability to deliver on previous agreements. Key revenue streams, such as drug trafficking and gambling operations, suffered disruptions as competing groups attempted to seize control. These shifts demonstrated the extent to which Rizzuto's personal presence had been a stabilizing factor. Without him, the family struggled to enforce contracts, maintain credibility, and protect its operational interests. At the same time, the vacuum allowed emerging figures and rival families to assert themselves in Montreal and the surrounding regions. Some of these rival groups had previously operated in the shadows or under Rizzuto's informal approval, but now they began challenging the family openly. Turf wars erupted, with former allies turning against each other to secure new territories and establish their own authority. These conflicts further destabilized the underworld, leading to a cycle of violence that drew increased attention from law enforcement and the media. Law enforcement capitalized on the chaos, intensifying investigations into the Rizzuto family and associated networks. Police operations, arrests, and surveillance efforts escalated, putting additional pressure on the already destabilized organization. The combination of internal conflict, rival encroachment, and legal scrutiny severely weakened the family's cohesion and operational efficiency. Activities that had once been tightly coordinated became fragmented and vulnerable, illustrating the precarious nature of criminal networks that rely heavily on the leadership of a single individual. The collapse of the Rizzuto empire also had a psychological and social impact on the organization's members. Many associates experienced fear, uncertainty, and betrayal, as the removal of Rizzuto disrupted established hierarchies and exposed individuals to retaliation from rivals or law enforcement. Trust, a foundational element of the organization, eroded rapidly. This erosion of confidence made coordinated action difficult, further accelerating the decline of the family's influence and leaving former territories and operations exposed to takeover by opportunistic competitors. Internationally, the power vacuum resonated beyond Montreal. Partners in the United States and Europe observed the instability and recalibrated their own alliances accordingly. Rizzuto's absence demonstrated that cross-border operations, while lucrative, were highly dependent on consistent leadership and enforcement of authority. The family's diminished influence weakened its negotiating position with foreign associates, limiting its access to key criminal markets and resources. Ultimately, the collapse of the criminal empire highlighted the dual nature of power in organized crime. While a strong leader can maintain order, stability, and growth, the removal of that leader can precipitate rapid disintegration. For the Rizzuto family, decades of careful planning and consolidation unraveled quickly, leaving a trail of violence, fractured alliances, and opportunistic rivals. The period following Vito Rizzuto's imprisonment serves as a case study in how personal authority and organizational structure are intertwined, and how the sudden absence of a central figure can expose even the most sophisticated criminal networks to vulnerability and chaos. After spending several years imprisoned in the United States for his alleged role in the 1981 triple murders, Vito Rizzuto returned to Canada in the mid-2000s, facing a drastically altered landscape in Montreal's criminal underworld. The power vacuum created during his incarceration had not only weakened the Rizzuto family's control but had also allowed rival factions to expand their influence. The challenge for Rizzuto was no longer merely maintaining operations. It was the delicate task of rebuilding authority, restoring loyalty, and reclaiming a position in a world that had evolved in his absence. His attempt at a comeback illustrates the complexities of power restoration in organized crime and the persistent risks even experienced leaders face. Rizzuto's strategy for re-establishing control relied heavily on rebuilding trust and loyalty within the family. Years of internal conflict during his imprisonment had fractured relationships among lieutenants and associates. Many members had either aligned with rival groups or acted independently to secure their own positions. Rizzuto needed to reassert himself not through indiscriminate force but by demonstrating that the family could regain cohesion under his leadership. This required careful negotiation, selective enforcement, and the reinstatement of hierarchies that had been disrupted. His approach reflected a blend of patience and authority. He understood that abrupt or overly aggressive actions could provoke further instability or invite law enforcement attention. Central to the comeback was the re-establishment of alliances, both locally and internationally. Montreal's underworld had shifted during Rizzuto's absence, with other criminal organizations claiming territories and influence previously controlled by his family. Rizzuto sought to renegotiate partnerships, mend fractured relationships, and reassert his family's presence in key criminal markets. These alliances were not merely transactional. They were symbolic demonstrations of power, signaling to both rivals and allies that the Rizzuto family remained a central figure in organized crime. In some cases, these negotiations involved strategic compromises, recognizing that rigid enforcement of pre-incarceration structures was neither feasible nor safe. The reclamation of operational control was another critical component. The Rizzuto family's enterprises, including drug trafficking, gambling, and money laundering, had suffered disruptions, and new actors had filled the gaps. Rizzuto implemented a mix of direct oversight and delegated authority, placing trusted lieutenants in key positions while retaining decision-making power over strategic matters. This approach allowed him to monitor operations, prevent internal betrayals, and gradually reassert dominance in revenue-generating activities. It also underscored his enduring strategic vision. Control was maintained not just through fear but through disciplined management and clear organizational structures. Rizzuto's return was not without resistance and violence. Some rival factions viewed his comeback as a threat, leading to a resurgence of targeted attacks, retaliation, and assassination attempts within the underworld. The period saw the continuation of the Montreal Mafia War, a sequence of killings and attacks that underscored the risks involved in reclaiming power. Rizzuto's responses were often calculated, involving selective enforcement rather than open confrontations. This approach balanced the need to demonstrate authority with the necessity of avoiding excessive visibility, which could provoke law enforcement scrutiny or wider conflict. Another defining aspect of the comeback was adapting to a changed environment. Montreal's underworld in the 2000s was not the same as it had been during the family's peak in the 1980s and 1990s. Law enforcement strategies had evolved, intelligence sharing between Canadian and U.S. authorities had increased, and criminal markets had diversified. Rizzuto's ability to navigate this new environment demonstrated both his adaptability and his understanding of modern organized crime dynamics. He combined traditional Sicilian methods of loyalty and secrecy with modern strategies for operational management, risk mitigation, and strategic negotiation, reflecting a sophisticated approach to reclaiming influence. Despite these efforts, the comeback was never complete. While Rizzuto regained significant influence and restored some degree of control over family operations, the underworld had permanently changed. Rivals had entrenched themselves, territories had been realigned, and the violent conflicts of the prior decade had left a lasting impact on Montreal's criminal ecosystem. Rizzuto's resurgence was therefore a measured reassertion of power rather than a full restoration of the empire he had once commanded. Nonetheless, his ability to reclaim authority after years of imprisonment highlighted his strategic acumen, resilience, and enduring reputation as a central figure in the North American organized crime scene. Ultimately, Rizzuto's attempt at a comeback illustrates the fragility and resilience of criminal networks. Even after prolonged absence and severe disruptions, leadership, reputation, and strategic planning can enable a skilled figure to regain influence, but never without risks, resistance, and the need to adapt to new realities. His efforts demonstrated that the Rizzuto family remained a formidable force, yet also emphasized the limits of power in a world where loyalty, opportunity, and violence are constantly in flux. Vito Rizzuto's death in December 2013 marked the end of one of the most influential chapters in the history of Canadian organized crime. At the time of his passing, he was widely recognized as the central figure who had shaped Montreal's underworld for decades, yet the impact of his life, and by extension his death, extends far beyond headlines or notoriety. Understanding his legacy requires examining not only the criminal empire he built and maintained but also the long-lasting effects on families, communities, and organized crime structures in Canada and internationally. Rizzuto died of natural causes at the age of 67, after surviving years of imprisonment, assassination attempts, and internal underworld conflicts. His death came during a period in which Montreal's criminal landscape was already experiencing significant transformation. Many of his lieutenants had been killed or imprisoned, rival factions had seized portions of his former operations, and law enforcement had strengthened its investigative capabilities. In many ways, his passing symbolized both the end of an era and the vulnerability of any organization heavily dependent on a single figure for cohesion and authority. One of the most significant aspects of Rizzuto's legacy is the resilience and influence of the organizational structures he built. Even after his death, the Rizzuto family's networks continued to exert influence in Montreal and in broader criminal markets. This persistence demonstrates that his strategic planning, structuring operations, cultivating loyal associates, and establishing international connections, was not entirely contingent on his personal presence. However, the family's diminished cohesion after his death also illustrates a key reality of organized crime. Leadership can be replaced, but the vacuum left by a figure like Rizzuto inevitably invites conflict, instability, and fragmentation. Rizzuto's death also had profound implications for rivals and the broader criminal ecosystem. With the central figure gone, competing factions saw opportunities to expand their influence, resulting in renewed turf disputes and strategic maneuvering. Law enforcement agencies, already attuned to the family's operations, intensified their efforts to exploit the organizational vulnerability. The combination of criminal opportunism and legal pressure created a complex environment in which the Rizzuto family's remaining influence was constantly challenged. This dynamic highlighted a recurring pattern in organized crime. The death of a key leader does not end the legacy of the organization, but it fundamentally reshapes its operations, alliances, and vulnerabilities. Another dimension of Rizzuto's legacy is the human cost of his career. Decades of criminal activity, violence, and internal conflicts left long-lasting effects on individuals and communities. Associates, rivals, and family members experienced loss, imprisonment, and fear, while neighborhoods in Montreal and beyond were exposed to the disruptions caused by underworld conflicts. Rizzuto's life story serves as a reminder that organized crime, even when shrouded in secrecy or strategic planning, leaves tangible social consequences that endure long after the central figure has passed. From a historical perspective, Rizzuto's life and death also cemented his role as a defining figure in Canadian organized crime. Scholars, journalists, and law enforcement officials study his career to understand the development of transnational criminal networks, the influence of Sicilian traditions in North America, and the interaction between criminal enterprises and legitimate business and political structures. His ability to navigate complex alliances, enforce discipline, and expand internationally provides a case study in both organizational management and the inherent risks of illicit power. Finally, Rizzuto's legacy is intertwined with the notion of power, strategy, and mortality in organized crime. His life illustrates how a single individual, through strategic vision, personal relationships, and calculated risk-taking, can exert extraordinary influence over both local and international criminal networks. Yet, his death also underscores the limitations of such power. No matter how carefully an empire is built, it is ultimately vulnerable to internal fragmentation, external pressure, and the inevitability of mortality. For historians and analysts, Rizzuto's career offers lessons in leadership, organizational dynamics, and the transient nature of influence in high-stakes, high-risk environments. In sum, Vito Rizzuto's death did not erase the imprint he left on Montreal's criminal world, nor did it undo the extensive networks he established. However, it marked a turning point, signaling the beginning of a new phase of instability, competition, and evolution within organized crime. His legacy is thus a cautionary tale of power, resilience, and the enduring consequences of a life devoted to illicit enterprise, affecting individuals, communities, and the underworld long after his passing.